check back, and the other people who've missed out today can watch it in their own time. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do an exercise called Draw 4. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to take a piece of paper and a pen. I'm going to do it now and demonstrate it. And you're going to divide that piece of paper into 4 quadrants. Doesn't have to be done well, as you can see. And what I want you to do is I am going to give you about 30 seconds to draw in the top left quadrant a picture reflecting how you're feeling today. Then I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. Dan, if you've already started, you can put your pen down. I'm watching you, right? And then I'm going to ask you in the second quadrant for 30 seconds to draw the answer to draw a innovative product or service that you love. The third quadrant, bottom left, I'm going to ask you to draw the best, a visual representation of the best idea you've had recently. And finally, I'm going to ask you to draw a problem in the world that you'd like to see solved. Okay, so I am going to get my timer. I hope you've got a pen and paper. And don't worry, you get the chance to explain them, and you're not going to be asked, you're not going to be forced, you might be asked, you're not going to be forced to share them with the whole group, just 1 or 2 other people. So when you are ready, can you very quickly jump on the chat and say why if you're ready with your pen and your paper and you've drawn a 4 quadrant? Pop a Y in the chat for me so I know you're ready to go. Oh, excellent. Good people. Thank you very much. Okay, which I'm see this is also giving me a little bit of thinking time because I'm nice like that. Okay, you ready? Quadrant 1. How are you feeling today? Draw a picture that reflects it. Go. If you've just joined us, if you take a piece of paper, draw it into 4 quadrants. I know someone's just popped in the room like that. And then you're going to draw a picture in each of the quadrants to answer each of the questions. So you've got 30 seconds to draw that top left picture of how you're feeling today. Okay, now move to quadrant 2, top right. And I'd like you to draw a picture of an innovative product or service that you love. Okay, move to quadrant 3, bottom left. The best idea you've had recently. Draw a picture of that. And finally, move across to quadrant 4 and a problem in the world that you would like to see solved. Stop. Put your pens down. There's a couple of you that clearly are really quick at Pictionary, and I would want to be on your teams because you were super, super fast at that. Okay, so you should now have some kind of scroll. And just to demonstrate that I am not doing this because I'm good at drawing, mine is there. I'm definitely not good at drawing. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to pop you into pairs, and you've got 4 minutes total as a pair to quickly talk each other through the answers to your questions and your pictures. Okay, so you can just hold it up to the screen and share it. So I'm going to pop you into groups, and we're going to do this twice. So you get 2 people to share your ideas with. And I'm just going to about why I might have asked you to do that activity in that way. So given we're talking about problem solving, and innovation and innovative thinking, I'm going to ask you to second guess me, because we're talking about leadership here, and we're talking about opportunities for you guys to learn how to lead groups and help them problem solve in better ways, as well as doing so yourself and be innovative in thinking. So can you just jump over to chat, take a minute or two, and then have a think about, why do you think I asked you to do that activity in that way? And pop over in the chat and put as much or as little as information as you would like about why you think I asked you to do that activity.
Maybe.
So totally unexpected, with minimal time to come up with something, so it was very impulsive. First step to brainstorm individually, then share as a group, so everyone gets heard, but also time to think themselves. Look at you guys as excellent facilitators in training stroke already. What else? Quick, easy, and get to see people's feelings and views in the world. To think of examples of how we've been creative and draw parallels. Cool, you guys are on it today. Like, these are full and thoughtful responses. I like it. What else? Anyone else? A chance to reflect. Yep. So all of those things are true. And when I think, so I'm going to talk you through this because I think it's useful. So I sat here yesterday and I'd written a session, but I hadn't got the opening activity. And so that's a problem, right? I'm sitting there thinking I could do something the same, but we're 4 weeks on the trot, so it's going to feel really samey. And I don't really think it's going to help us address the question. So I sat down and thought, okay, how am I going to find the best activity to fit this block? So I'm going to look at my boundaries or margins. I'm going to say, okay, I've got X amount of time at the beginning of the session. I know it's going to be at the beginning of the session, so people won't have had a chance to prep. I want to do something different that I've done before. I want to do something that is going to allow me to create questions that will suit the theme. And I want to get them thinking in a way that's different, right? So straight away I thought, okay, well, I know one of the things we haven't done a lot of is what's called visual representation, which is what you've just done. You've drawn a picture, right? And I think Greg mentioned about doing it impromptu and speedily. I've never asked you to draw before. I don't think. I've asked you to colour in before. I've never asked you to draw before. I certainly haven't asked you to answer questions through drawing. And so I think it was Greg who said it. Greg's absolutely right. The springing it on you helps your brain to flip-flop between things, and it also stops you from going down certain avenues when you draw. But also I wanted to give you the privacy of describing it to someone else, so you would never feel like your drawing was being judged, because it's not about the drawing really, it's just about getting it's tapping into a different part of your brain to stop you overthinking the answer to the question. So like Hamish said, the speed meant most people spoke truthfully and naturally. So that is a real art when you are trying to solve problems, particularly when you are a leader. When you are a leader, people will tell you what they want you to hear and what they think you want to hear quite a lot. So aside from the old controversial figure who'll do the opposite. So one of the real challenges is, how can you have lots of different ways of tapping into your team and getting them to think differently and getting them to share honestly? And there's a couple of things to pull out of that I'd really like to share before we move on. One is, whenever I have any problem, big or small, I come up with a process, because a process will help me get to the place I want to be. Secondly, I'm really clear what I'm trying to achieve, because or what the problem is, or what the idea I want to innovate is, or whatever it is. And then the third really important thing is that I explore lots of options. So I had 6 or 7 different activities in my head that I was looking at, going, oh yeah, we could do that, we could do that, we could do that. And then I didn't get too hung up on it, because it's 10 minutes activity at the beginning of our session. So when we go through today's session, the reason I wanted to share that with you is we're going to take that process. We're going to think about what the process is, how to structure our thinking, how to avoid problems with our thinking and with other people's thinking. And then we're going to have a go at one. And as you probably know, I quite enjoy, I think someone's even spotted that this is a theme that we do on our podcast. I quite like looking at definitions, because I think it helps create a place of common start point. So the definitions that I've chosen for today, we're going to introduce a couple of others later on, but to start with, we're going to talk about just problem solving and innovation. So for me, problem solving is the process of constructing and applying mental representations of problems to find solutions to those problems that are encountered in nearly every context. So in other words, in simple speak, Problem solving is used everywhere in every situation, and we use our mental faculties to create a mental image or definition of the problem, and then we set about solving it. So it's all in our heads, even when we start writing it down and creating a process. And then innovation, and I've stolen, this is quite an unusual one, I've stolen this from the government because I quite like it, weirdly. Innovation is the practical implementation of ideas that result in the introduction of new goods or services or improvement in offering of goods or services. Now, that definition is very specifically about government innovation projects, but the bits that they are right about is that it is practical. It is about implementing ideas that bring something new to the table, right? And that's really important. We need to find the ideas, we need to think about how to execute them, and then we need to bring them to the table. And that's what innovation is. It's no good coming up with 500 great ideas, right? There's loads of people wandering around with 500 great ideas. It's how do we assess if they are realistic? How do we create them into something that is applicable to the real world? So we're going to start by talking a little bit about structured thinking. But before we do, as always, I'd love you to jump onto the chat and tell me what you think is meant by structured thinking. I've given you a few clues already. So when you've got an answer, don't worry about it being right or wrong. I'm not gonna, and I'm not picking any particular definition. This is just my view on what it is. I can't even say it. Methodical, thank you, progression. Thinking about something in stages, methodically, only allowing yourself to think of the problem at hand, no daydreaming or spiraling. Millie, it's like you're in my life. Daydreaming and spiraling is what I do best. Gathering thoughts and ideas in order to approach them in a logical and realistic manner. A structure like a reflection model, like the Gibbs cycle, putting some sort of framework into a problem. That's unstructured. Okay, lots of those things are accurate. I'm going to share what I mean by it. We also got having a goal problem, thinking around it and how to solve it, having a framework. So lots of frameworks, models, stuff like that. When I talk about structured thinking, I'm going even more specific about that. And a lot of what you've talked about in your answers is either very similar to this or is something we're going to pick up when we talk about the process of problem solving. But when I talk about structured thinking, I'm talking about a specific approach or design to your thinking. So rather than just thinking, it's saying, I'm going to think critically, or I'm going to think observationally, or I'm going to think expansively. It's that the approach I've chosen for my thinking fits the purpose of the thinking. So if I'm sitting here thinking about what exercise to choose at the beginning of today's session, for example, as we talked about, I am going to be trying to think first critically about what do I want from the session, and then as expansively as I can to think about what are all the ideas I could have. And then I'm going to choose one. It's really important with structured thinking that there is a clearly defined outcome for the thinking. And we're going to get on to what goes wrong with problem solving and thinking around problem solving, but that's probably the biggest, that people think without being really clear about what they're trying to get out of the thinking or the conversation or the group activity. And sometimes structured thinking will form part of a process, or indeed different structured thinkings will be combined to create a process of problem solving or innovation. But the structured thinking itself is at its base, you or someone else creating intentionality about a period of time when you're thinking. So if you are trying to collect as much information as possible from a lecture, you are effectively doing as much thinking as possible that is not analysing. So you're literally observing through your ears and through your eyes and all your other senses as much as possible. And that's observational thinking, right? You're not trying to process it, you're just trying to get it down. You will be infinitely more efficient as a human being functioning if you can be intentional and structured in your thinking and decide what thinking to do when. And I say that like it's easy. It's so not. Because we're reactionary as humans. We've talked about this before. We're social beings, we're evolutionary, and we do things according to how we've been wired over hundreds of years. And so our reactivity is what drives the way we think, right? So when we're scared, we think a certain way. When we're tired, we think a certain way. And it's all designed to keep us alive. The problem is we've evolved and our brains haven't quite caught up with us yet. So it's really important and empowering if you can be structured in the way that you think when you're thinking. So I'm going to this is the theory bit. So hold on tight and I'll get us through it. and then we're going to have a little bit of a chat about it. But there's a couple of pieces of theory I want to talk to you about. One is the 2 types of thinking. There's lots more than 2 types. This is the 2 that I want to talk about at the moment because I think it's most helpful, and it's the ones that specifically we tend to have problems with. Divergent and convergent thinking. Nothing fancier than what it says. Divergent is exploring all the opportunities. Convergent is literally closing all those opportunities down to 1 or as few as you need. Okay? The challenge is they are different approaches as an individual, and they are different approaches when done in groups. And we often do convergent thinking when we need to be doing divergent thinking. It's the most common issue, particularly in the world we live in, which is fast-paced, deadline-driven. Those of you who've read Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow will see some similarities, not quite, but similar around these. But fundamentally, we very quickly find a possibility we like and we hang on to it. I'm going to explain a little bit why later and teach how not to. But for the moment, it's really important to think about, at the very simplest, you need to be deciding if you're divergent thinking or convergent thinking and approach it appropriately. Then what happens is that divergent thinking and convergent thinking can be brought together to create a process, right? And so this is one example of a process. Loads you can build, right? You can build all sorts of orders and all sorts of ways of doing it. But at its simplest, what they say is, if I have a general problem, I need first to observe and gather data, and that's divergent thinking. So looking everywhere I can for information. If you think about it from the purposes of the workshop activity I chose, first I was like, right, what are all my limitations? What have I got? Well, I've got a time limitation. I've got to look at all the different places I get activities. We're online, so I know it can't be physical. So I'm looking around all the time for information to help me make that decision. Then you go, okay, so what does that tell me? Well, that tells me I've got a certain number, I've got a certain defined problem, and that helps me, through that insight, define my very specific problem. Then I know exactly what my problem is, and I'm much clearer, and I can go off and generate ideas of how to do it. And in this case, for me, it was looking at my 10 favorite websites that have facilitation activities and going, right, I'm going to filter all these by the time, online, number of people I've got. I'm going to look at what they're trying to do and the flexible ones for the questions. And then that gives me like 5 to choose from. And then I had a quick run through in my head of those 5 and thought, okay, which one's going to work best for this group? Well, not the one that requires them to have had 10 years experience in the workplace, because you haven't got that yet, for example. And then I've got a solution. And I had 2 to choose from, and I chose this one because I thought it was fun. But the important thing about all of this is it's about structure and control. So we talked a little bit last week about training our brains a bit through resilience and well-being. This is exactly the same. Fundamentally, there's a lot that can be achieved as a leader if we can just get ourselves to be deliberate in the way that we think and feel. So at a whistle stop, that is structured thinking. It is clearly, and those of you who do psychology and anything like will know it's far more complicated than that. But as a leader, these are the 2 things that are helpful to know. You need to be clear when you're either asking a team or yourself to be divergent or convergent, and you need to think about how those combine in a process to be able to deliver you an output that you want, whether you're solving a problem or whether you're trying to innovate and create a new way of doing things. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you just to take a moment and take a pen and paper or open a new pad. And I'd like you to take a minute to answer the question first, do you think you're better at thinking individually or in a group, and why? And you just got 1 minute, just jot down a couple of points, if you can, of do you think you're better thinking individually or in a group, and why? Okay, and before we move on to the next question, can you put a C, a I or a G? So I for individual, if you're better at thinking individually, and a G if you're thinking group, and pop it in the chat now. Let's see who we've got. Oh, look, you're quick. You're quick and you're different. Okay. Oh, it's like it's almost a split, a little bit more individual. Okay. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to do exactly the same. Just spend a minute. Do you think you are better at convergent or divergent thinking? I'm going to put the picture back up on the left-hand side. So divergent, exploring possibilities, convergent, whittling those possibilities down. So the question that I'm asking you is, do you think you're better at divergent or convergent thinking? And you've got a minute just to jot down why. So that is, are you better at coming up with ideas and loads of them, or are you better at whittling them down and making a decision? In its simplest terms, not quite that simple, but.
Well, I'm getting my letters mixed up there, Jane, I think, aren't I?
All right, don't worry. Okay, so now if you can put a D or a C for divergent or convergent of what you think you're better at. You know what I wish I'd done now? I wish I'd written all these down because I want to see if there's a link. So my suspicion is that individuals are better at divergent, but I might convergent, but I might be wrong. Okay, so yet again a split. So there's 2 points to make, and then I'm going to just ask you to share why. So the first point to make is that without question, when you think in groups, it is better to have different types of people in the group. Okay. And that goes absolutely, we know that's true of things like different backgrounds, different contexts, different experiences of life, different ages, but it is also true in different ways and approaches to thinking. And the second is to understand as a leader that whatever you are better at, it will be harder for you to connect with people who think the other way, and therefore to be conscious of it when you're leading teams. So if you are brilliant at divergent thinking and come up with loads of ideas, but you've got a teammate who only really is good at coming up with, like, once the ideas are on the table, figuring out the best thing to do, you need to give them the time and space to do so, but you also need to help them and support them when they need to be coming up with ideas. So it's really important to understand this kind of stuff when you're working with other people, even when you're thinking about on the pitch, for example, when you're thinking about who's going to come up, who's going to be a more creative player because they're going to see more opportunities versus who's going to make better decisions more often. So it's really useful. What would be lovely now is if you could just read back the notes you've made, and of the notes made of why you think you're better. I'd like you to tell me in the chat, what do you think your strength is as a thinker? So it might be one of the 4 elements, might be thinking as an individual or a group, might be divergent or convergent, or it might be something else. You might say, actually, what I can see back from what I've written, I'm really good at coming up with lots of solutions when there's a problem, or I'm really good under pressure. So what do you think your strengths are as a thinker? And pop it in the chat. Just take a moment to read everyone else's once you've written yours. And imagine that instead of looking at people when you're building a team and deciding what technical skills they've got, which is really helpful, think about what it might be like to build a team based on the fact that all of you pretty much have got, with the exception of one or two, got very different strengths in the way that you think. And think about how much stronger as a problem-solving machine you would be if you could bring all those different ways of thinking together and create a process where people get to do those things. So it's really important when you're thinking about leading teams to understand people's preferences. Don't pander to them. It doesn't mean you have to let them always think only the way they do or only think individually and never make them do group activities. But it's about understanding where your strengths in your team are, just like you know who's better at goal attack and just like you know who's better in the last 10 minutes of a game. You need to understand what people are good at so that when you are thinking as a leader to problem solve or innovate, you understand the resources you have in the room with the people around you. And, you know, what's extraordinary is how articulate you all are about what you think your strengths are, right? And my challenge to you will be, because I think that's brilliant. I wasn't that clear for a long time on what my strengths were, but I would challenge you also to go and find someone you trust, whether that's a mentor, whether that's one of your teammates, whether that's your parents, whoever it is, and just say, this is what I think I'm good at. Does that ring true for you? Because it's a really powerful way of checking if you actually are aware of what your strengths are. And the other thing is, if you've said there's something you don't think you're strong at, so if you're stronger at convergent, you're a little bit nervous at divergent, go out and look at different ways and some of the ideas that we share today and have a go at them. Because I'm a massive convergent thinker. I get one really great idea and then I get hung onto it for dear life. And then you have to prise my hands. Dan knows because we've worked together quite a lot. You have to prise my hands away from it. But I also know Dan is a really amazing divergent thinker, whatever he said, right? So quite often we will send him stuff. I will send him stuff and go, here's where I am. Can you just unstop me from going down this route? And he'll come back and go, oh, you could do this, you could do that. And I think that's really powerful. But it took me ages to work that out. Dan.
Yeah, observation for me when I've been involved in these sort of thinking processes and brainstorming and trying to innovate, and is that often you sort of people go through the process, but often they don't really open up all the ideas that are there, because actually there's some initial premise, if you like, that has never been challenged. And so it's almost like you're going through this process exactly as it is on the graph that I'm looking in front of me just here, but it's almost like within this little pre-existing boundary. And so really all this stuff goes on, but actually it's only within this little tiny area, and there's actually this whole other world out here that never really gets considered. I'm not sure. I don't know if there was a question. It was just an observation. Really, I suppose.
No, it's a really good one.
Find that, and if there's a way of trying to break out of that a little bit.
So it's a really, really good one, and we're going to pick it up in process. But there's two things I would say that is really helpful. One is the biggest mistake people make is solving the wrong problem, right? Without fail, they solve the problem they're given, not the problem that exists, right? So one of the most powerful things you can do is, before you even get into choosing your approach, it's making sure you understand the problem as it is, and spend time gathering information that allows you to challenge that. The second part that you'll need, which we're going to cover in comms on the last week, is challenging upwards. So one of the challenges that we have in organizations is that we get presented. So learning and development is a classic, right? You go into an HR department in an organization, which at some point you guys all will if you haven't already, and they will say to me, we would like you to deliver resilience training. And I will say to them, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And they'll say, everyone's resilience is low. And I'll say, well, could I please come in and talk to some of them so that I can understand why their resilience is low? Because only then will I know if training is going to help. And 9 times out of 10, it turns out they're overworked and that they're not allocating tasks well enough. And no amount of resilience training is going to help with that, because the problem is incorrect. So the two things you need when you are challenging those processes is, am I honestly, truly solving the right problem? And if I think I'm not, or if I think there's something else to it, how do I speak up and challenge that problem? We're going to talk about the second in weeks at the end of March, week after next, but we're going to talk about the process bit of asking the questions a little bit further on. Does that make sense?
It does, but we just now have to pick up on the comment that's in chat about pig wrestling, because I now need to know about that.
Oh my God, it's amazing. Hannah, you're so right. I'll put a link up to the end. Oh, okay. Hannah, have you read it? Do you want to come off and just explain it? Or is that putting you on the spot?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, I've got noise in the background.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, I was recommended to read it, and it's really, really interesting. It's slightly odd to read, but once you've like reflected on it, like you suddenly realize you use it like months down the line. But it basically is kind of it's like a fable, I think is the word. And it uses really interesting visual techniques to like work through problems. And I guess the comment that you said, Jane, around and like doing resilience training and then actually they're just being overworked, it kind of helps to understand that. But it's a great read. It's kind of random, but yeah, it's really interesting.
So I would absolutely endorse reading Pig Wrestling as a completely brilliant example of how literally someone has gone off and created a completely different way of thinking about it. So largely Pig Wrestling, the book, is trying in some ways to answer the issues created by something called wicked problems. That's where a lot of the thinking came from, but it's done in such an innovative and different way that it just blows your doors off in terms of the way your brain thinks and the way you try and think about problems. And it's lovely and it's a beautiful, easy read. So yes, thank you for sharing that. It's the sort of book you read and you go, I wish I could have written that. That's really clever. But it's also very specifically about solving problems and how to think about the stages that you're getting through and going back to defining what the problem really is. So thank you for having a go at that reflection. Hopefully you can understand a little bit about structured thinking now, and specifically about where your own strengths and weaknesses may lie in that, or indeed, I think someone mentioned some of them are both strengths and weaknesses, depending on the context, which is absolutely true. And also the importance of trying to assemble different thinkers. As you progress in your leadership career, you will find that it is harder and harder to find people who will be open, honest, and candid with you. And you will have to work harder and harder to create an open, honest, and candid environment. And therefore, the better that you can get at facilitating these kind of ways of thinking and be aware of your own strengths and weaknesses, the better chance you've got of creating teams and organizations and sports teams and working teams that are both effective but also well balanced. There is nothing worse than a team full of really heavily weighted divergent thinkers, because they will generate 4,000 ideas and never get anything done. And there is nothing worse than a team full of only convergent thinkers, because they will choose one solution and they will hammer it even though it's going wrong. And people mostly can do both, but they're just stronger at one than the other. But I have seen sort of extreme examples. So now I want to just move on and talk a little bit about improving our thinking and cognitive biases. And the reason I want to do this is because problem solving and innovation and innovative thinking largely are completely thrown off track when we allow our cognitive biases to take hold. So it seems an appropriate place to both talk about it and have some practical reflections on how it might affect us. So when I talk about our cognitive biases, there are, at last count on Wikipedia, 242 of them, right? And a cognitive bias is nothing more complicated than a predisposition in our brain to think a certain way. And there's different types of cognitive biases. Some of them are patterns that we've learned and that we choose to make shortcuts to speed up our reaction times. Some of them are patterns that we have developed based on what we have learned or experienced. So if we have never seen a rhino in real life, then we will have assumptions based on the information that we've had available, which might be poor information. So we might actually not recognize one when we see one because we've only ever looked at pictures of it, for example, although David Attenborough fortunately has solved that problem. But there are, fundamentally, they are the fallibility of our brain. And they are designed to keep us alive. They are designed to keep us moving fast, making good decisions. but actually they also mean that we make imperfect decisions. They might be good, but they're imperfect. We make assumptions about people, but also we will wire ourselves. So if we're risk averse, for example, we might have a specific set of cognitive biases. And there are so many of them. And they're discovering more all the time, right? They're discovering more and more because some of them are contextual about the world we live in. You can see there's just a ridiculous number of them. They've got some brilliant names, but I'm going to talk to you just in a bit more detail about one, and then I'm going to give you two that I think are particularly relevant to leaders. And I think we've mentioned cognitive biases before with you guys, but I want to talk to you about them and get you thinking about them as leaders. So the Zeigarnik effect: incomplete or interrupted tasks are better remembered than complete ones. And I've talked about this before. Dan and I go away. I promise to do 12 things. Dan promises to do 6. Dan does all 6. I do 10. I will be remembered for not completing my list. Dan will be remembered for completing his list, even though I've done 10 more. And so when people say, you know, under promise, over deliver, that's literally what they're saying. Try and keep it low, but also understand that you will do the same thing to people in your team. So people who want to please you will try and promise more. They might do more than everyone else, but if they don't do the things that you want, or if you notice the things that they haven't done, you are much more likely to hold them out as not being as good as other people. So it's really important you learn to say no, because people remember what you have not done, but they don't mind so much when you say no, which is unbelievable, but true. But the two I want to talk to you about in detail are the IKEA effect and the confirmation bias. And the IKEA effect is that, it's a brilliant name, people love things more when they've created them themselves, right? So when you build a piece of IKEA furniture versus when someone else comes in and builds it and it looks exactly the same, you will love yours more because you built it, right? And that is true of problems, and that is true of innovative ideas, and that is true of processes that you have set up in an organizational team or strategies that you've developed. And confirmation bias is when people unconsciously search for information that supports or validates their views and beliefs. And I could slip off into a social media rant at this point, but I won't. And we rate the information that confirms what we believe more highly. So if you imagine you're working in an organization or running a sports team, and you come up with a great new tactic to be the best next year, you will look for people and information that will support that yours will work, and that your brain will automatically seek it out. So when you read a page, you'll see the things that endorse what your approach is, right? And what I want to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to think as a leader what problems this might create and what you can do to avoid it, right? And I'm going to split into groups, and I'm going to ask you to think about one or the other, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. So I'm going to put you into, I think, probably 4 groups. I'm going to put 2 groups on the IKEA effect and 2 groups on confirmation bias. And I'm going to ask you to think about, as a leader, what is the problem with the IKEA effect if you have it? And what can you personally do as the leader to avoid it? So thinking about your team, a team that you work with, or a team that you've worked with in the past, what can you do to avoid that? So I'm going to pop you into breakouts, and I'm going to label the breakout rooms, which I think you'll be able to see. So let's just recreate these. 55, that, and we're going to move. Sorry guys, just take me a minute. So Claire, Chloe, Hamish and Hannah will be IKEA 1. Caitlin, Clara and Tristan will be IKEA 2. Jake, Lauren and Millie will be the confirmation 1. And Greg, Katie and Meg will be confirmation 2. And I'm just going to open the rooms and their names, so hopefully you can see them as well. And you've got 6 minutes to discuss this. So depending on which bias you've got, as a leader, what is the problem and what can you do to avoid that problem specifically? One idea of why you think it's a problem for leaders, and one idea of what you could do to avoid that bias. So don't worry too much in a group if like more than one of you puts down. I'm not going to count them up or anything like that. I'm just curious to see what you guys talked about and what you liked. So if each of you could go under whichever group you're in, don't worry too much if you can't remember which group, just click it like on the edge. But hopefully you can remember whether you were talking about the IKEA event or the confirmation bias. Makes you narrow mind. Oh, someone's done this perfectly. Thank you. You've clearly done it before. If you can't use annotate for whatever reason, pop it in the chat and I'll do it for you. So yeah, Millie, if you're on your phone or anything like that, anyone else, if you just put either a C or an I to let me know whether you're talking about confirmation or IKEA, put it in the chat and I will put it in for you. Let's see how everyone else is getting on. So what problem do these biases create for leaders and what could you do to avoid it? You become precious of your ideas. Sometimes I wonder if some of you are living in my head, because that would be very similar. No new changes to be made. Get someone else's perspective. Old systems remain despite being potentially outdated. Yep. If you want to differentiate, you can change the color. Oh, I've got some in here. Brilliant. I'll add these in. So text to see. Crikey, that's definitely bright, isn't it? And then and then if you've got a chance, if you had a chance to talk about what could you do to avoid it, pop that underneath. No diversity of ideas if there's a culture of fear and not challenging people in positions of power and responsibility. Someone else's perspective. Honest and fact-driven reviews or discussions. Consult with those above you in terms of authority if you're struggling to convince those around you. Give everyone a chance to speak and encourage it. An effective system for feedback from the masses. God, you sound like you're about to you wanted to take over the world there, Tristan. Oh, wrong one. Dan, is it something you've experienced, thinking about these biases for yourself when you've been leading organisations, and what have you done to try and counter any biases you have?
The IKEA effect one, absolutely. I think I see that everywhere in terms of particularly when you see people, often when you see people coming into new leadership positions, you see, well, maybe this isn't, I'll be interested where you think is this part of the IKEA effect, where you see that people are they basically are desperate to use their own idea or to throw away a previous idea because they want to be seen to use a new one. It's something I see very commonly. And there's plenty of good stuff that just gets binned because there's a new person that wants to do things, be seen to do things their way and be seen to innovate and do something new. Is that part of the IKEA effect?
So no, but it is a cognitive bias. So there's two cognitive biases at play. One is, I'm trying to find the name of it, but it's preference for new things. So organizations, particularly organizations in sectors that are trying to modernize, have a bias towards new things, and leaders within them will, even if those new things are not necessarily better or are better, but not to the value it will cost to make them. So that's super common. And it's one of, if you fancy working in sport, people, I'm warning you now, that is probably one of the worst. You walk into organizations and people, you've been working on an idea for ages. Someone will come in as a consultant, offer an idea that's a bit better, but the cost of doing it will throw everything else out and won't be worthwhile, and it won't realize that the value won't be realized, and it will still get done because people are biased towards it. So that's one. And then the other one that you would be a common cognitive bias would be we are biased against things that happen when we're not there. So it's similar to IKEA, but if we weren't in the room when that decision was made, we are less likely to trust it or be involved in it. And for new staff, that's particularly common.
Then the other thing I see on the confirmation bias one I see a lot is in a coaching situation where you have people that use where you've got coaches would often use statistics. The ones use like match charting, match analysis, things to to inform their decision making, but they'll often use match analysis methods that suit their ideas of how the game should be played.
Yeah.
So they measure the game in a way that is always going to give them the answer that they're looking for.
Absolutely.
And they rarely sort of rip things up and look at and measure the game in a different way that might give them a different way of thinking.
Yeah. So those of you that are studying social sciences will know that there is huge bias in the academic world based on whether people have a preference for quantitative or qualitative based on their ontology or epistemology of the way they think. So people who like numbers and believe there's one truth and that there's only one answer will only ever use the techniques and the methodologies that will give them one answer or one truth. And people who believe there are multiple answers and truths will lean towards qualitative, which will allow them to do that. And so choosing the tools that give us the best chance of getting the answer we want is super common. And the reason I'm talking about this in problem solving is that it is very, very big part of problem solving is making sure that you can be honest and truthful with the people solving the problem and challenge. And so the way you do that is challenge. Now, the things you guys have called out about what you can do to avoid it, get other people's perspectives, have someone who checks you and says you're being a toddler. All-time favorite. I have done that many times in my career. I've had a member of my team be like, "Oi, give me a kick in the shin," quite literally, if I'm being, it wasn't called toddler, but it was close. We talked about being open-minded. The biggest thing that you haven't mentioned, and why would you? That's why I'm here to tell you, is you can, as a leader, articulate that bias. And it completely dispels it. So if you say, "Hey guys, I built this," or "it was always my solution, and I'm really conscious that makes me preference it. So when we're talking about that, let's put it on the table, put it aside for a minute, and let's talk about what else there is." As a leader, you can speak last in meetings. There's a great book, Simon Sinek, Why Do Leaders Eat Last? And he talks a lot about why leaders need to put themselves behind everyone else, A, for the good of the team, but also because it allows other people to talk. As a leader, you can, particularly with confirmation bias, you can articulate your view at the beginning of the meeting and say, or at the beginning of a team strategy discussion and say, "Hey guys, how about this? First 5 minutes, I want you to destroy what I've just suggested. And let's see if we can just get that off the table and decide if that's actually not even viable." So that articulating it, A, builds trust with your team because they're like, "Oh, he gets it, she gets it, they understand there's an issue there," right? But also it will make it better fair game for other people to dismiss or dispel. And the other thing I would really strongly advise you to do is whenever you're in a leadership position and you're with a team, write down your preference, write down what you built, and write down your biases. So if you go into a meeting, just jot them down on your note. You don't even have to share it with anyone. Just jot down, here are the things coming into this meeting that I prefer, like, want, have been involved in. And have that list in front of you when people are talking. And that alone will be a cue to your brain, unless you're very self-interested, which is a slightly different story. But if you're genuinely trying to be unbiased, that will be a cue to your brain to look at it, as long as it's in front of you the whole time, and stop speaking every time someone else articulates that idea, because you know you're going to pick it up and you're going to endorse it. And so those are really simple things you can do to reduce the level of bias. The sad news is you absolutely cannot get rid of them. Like, you can program your brain to have them less and less and less, but there's really no evidence that we can like get rid of them altogether, because it's just not how our brains work. But neuroplasticity means we can reduce them. So, but all of the other things you said around being open-minded, giving everyone a chance to speak, encourage it, consult with people to understand what you've got permission to do and not, have someone to check, get other people's perspectives. Don't tell people which one's your idea. It's always good. Find out what they really think. I had a conversation, I'll give you a very practical example with an organisation I won't name. Having a conversation with at the moment. I would like to run a focus group to determine how things are going about one of their projects without the CEO. The CEO wants to host it. I'm trying to explain to the CEO that if he's in the room, he won't get the truth and he won't hear the truth. He will hear and look for the answers he wants. Whereas if I can do it without him, I've got a better chance because I really don't care what the answer is. And so one of the reasons organizations get so many consultants in is quite often for that. They want to get an honest, unbiased, or the reverse. They get consultants in who will tell them what they want to hear against their staff. And as you move up through organizations, you'll have to deal with that. Quite common in sport, politics, less common in things like engineering, manufacturing and production, very common in high-level strategic IT. Consultants everywhere who will tell you exactly what you want to hear. So those are some there's hundreds. I'll send you a link to all the confirmation biases. There's hundreds of them. I know I've talked about them. I've probably sent you that link before, but they are, even if you just learn one every week for a year, you'd get through not all of them at all, but you'd definitely enrich and become more aware of the way in which your brain is looking for patterns. So what I'm going to suggest do now is I'm just going to give you a 3-minute break because we've been talking nonstop and in and out of break rooms very quickly. We didn't do a break last week. So I'm going to just give you a 3-minute break. So if you need to stretch, go to the bathroom, fill up your water, text your mum and say you're going to phone her at 7:05, whatever it is, we're just going to give you a 3-minute break back at 6:26 for the last 35 minutes. Okay. So hopefully that's everyone coming back and you're all here. We've got, for the last 35 minutes on, so we've got two very brief sort of bits about the power process for ideation, and then I'm going to take you through an ideation process called De Bono, which is non-evidence, so they haven't done much research on it in terms of the way it works, but it's incredibly popular, and I personally found it really useful, and it's fun, and I like fun, because I think if you can bring some fun into the workplace, life's not so bad. But first, we're going to talk about the power of problem-solving process. So when you're trying to solve a problem, I've already mentioned the importance of structure in your thinking of each phase, but now we need to build it into a process. And the reason you need a process, really, there's 5 elements that it really makes a difference. A process will force you to think about and allocate the right amount of time to each stage of the process. A process will allow you to think about and involve as many people as is helpful and useful. A process will force you to think about what type of structured thinking you want for each stage, and therefore you're more likely to do it. You'll be able to create a shared plan for the problem solving, and you'll be able to achieve, or ideally achieve, clarity on the outcome for the problem. And none of these things have to be a 3-week project plan that you submit to your boss, right? This could be a 10-minute conversation between me and Andy going, all right, we've got this problem. We've got to decide how many sessions we run with the students over the next 4 weeks. We're going to sit down, right? Well, we need to tell them something by next week. I think we need to involve ourselves, probably get some ideas from the students, and then fundamentally make a decision based on budget. Before we get down to it, it would be really helpful if we could just come up with like 5 or 6 different ideas. And then let's make a plan of how we roll that out. Are we really sure why we're doing this? Well, we're doing this to engage the most number of students with the best quality material, but get them ready for the end of year and get it done by then. Right, we had that conversation with Amy and Dan in like 20 minutes, like maybe 30 minutes. So it doesn't have to be long, but it is really important to understand why you want a process and what it helps you achieve. I'm going to very briefly talk you through one type of process, loads of problem-solving processes. I like this one because it's super simple. It's called the A3 thinking approach. And hopefully Dan will see that stage 1 is part of his, it's not all, but it's part of his question. So what is the problem and why are we spending time on it? And that second question is the question you need, right? Loads of people go, oh, what's the problem? I understand the problem. But they jump, like Dan says, straight into the problem they think it is. Why is it worth spending time on this problem? Will allow you to explore the problems above, the root causes, and what you're trying to actually solve. And it's in that space you need to be able to challenge as much as possible and as frequently as possible to get to the appropriate answer. Stage 2 is about saying, what is the current state? It is really common for me to sit down with senior leaders in organizations and they'll say, oh, we want to improve motivation. I think I told you this first week we met. Oh, we want to improve motivation. And my question is always, how do you know what level of motivation there is in your team at the moment? And they look at me like I'm mad. They're like, well, no, but it's just, of course we want to improve motivation. Well, what if it's already maximum? What if it's terrible and there's a reason? Why, I can't tell you how much it's going to be unless I know the beginning. Then we have to be really clear on a desired future state. And I would say also a very realistic future state. So I've been into organizations. They said, oh, we want to solve this problem. Classic one is sports organizations. Oh, we want to solve membership like a national governing body. Oh, we want to solve the problem of increasing membership. And I'm like, okay, right. Where would you like to get to? And they're like, well, we'd love 1 million members. And I'm like, but you've got 35,000. You're not going to get to 1 million. There aren't 1 million people in this country that would have access to resources, and you don't have the organisation capacity to support 1 million people. Oh, but 1 million sounds nice and round. It's a terrible answer. Root cause analysis, which has got a really fabulous thing, which I will send you a link to, called fishbone analysis, which is the simplest picture ever, but it's a way of fleshing out problems. And the idea of root cause analysis is saying, okay, why is the problem happening? What is the causal or the correlatory factors? What are the things going on that mean this problem is emerging? And then, and this is really critical, and this is why I love A3, even though I can't spell approach, is thinking about both short-term and long-term solutions. And this is another way of thinking that you might find you prefer. Some people prefer solving short-term, some people prefer solving long-term. Ideally, what you need to do is look at quick fixes, bug fixes, if you're into tech, right? They call it bug fixes and quick fixes. And that's like, what are the things that we could just improve things a little bit quickly because, the computer's sticking. So for example, we were working with some people on Zoom, and one of the quick fixes was, well, let's just deliver it on WebEx next week instead, right? That's not a long-term fix for the fact that none of that organization can access Zoom and is having problems to accessing the learning, but it was a short-term solution. Longer term, we needed to better build and adapt our material for organizations as they were moving to Teams, which we couldn't access at all, for example. And then making a really clear action plan. It's not a complicated process, but I really like it. There's lots more complicated ones that you'll be able to pick up. But that's a really simple, straight-term process, and you can find loads of material about it on how to approach problem solving. And then you need to implement. So it's all well and good coming up with the problem, but as we talked about when we're talking about innovation, it's also really important problem solving to be able to implement a solution. And so really practical stuff around this, like capturing actions, identifying owners, setting due dates, creating a plan, tracking process, and giving people time to work or solve those problems. And we're going to come back to that next week because we're going to develop a lot of that stuff into project planning discussion next week, as well as prioritization. So 5 things to watch out for when solving problems. These are my 5 biggest things that people make mistakes. And it doesn't matter whether the problem you're solving is buying a house, building a new organizational team, allocating resources for your football strip. People do all of these things across all of that. People jump to solutions as soon as they either like them, have come up with themselves, or can see one that might be viable. So spending time ideating, which is what we're going to talk about next, and coming up with as many ideas as possible is really important. People solve the wrong problems. We've already talked about this. You need to do root cause analysis. You need to really think about why this problem's happening. People create solutions that cause problems for other people. So in a lot of organizations I've worked in, particularly in our sector, they tend to be quite siloed. Organizations, teams work quite separately. They'll create amazing solutions, but it will turn out it will mess up someone else's work that they're working on. So as a leader, it's your job to talk to other leaders, whether that's in your sports club, whether that's in your organization, whether that's in your team, to understand what problems they're trying to solve and to work with those leaders. So when you're a leader, you have 2 teams always. You have the team you're leading and you have the team you're part of above you. CEOs still have teams, right? They just have teams at board level. Boards still have teams because they have both themselves, but then they'll also be answerable to funders or to regulators. So everyone's always got a team above them, even entrepreneurs, because they've got customers and investors. So the 4th is asking teams to solve problems without giving them time to work on it. Problem solving is not, as we've discussed, a quick 5 minutes on the back of the paper. It is a process that you build and think about, and people need to spend time appropriately doing it. And so this is a very specific one that I want to mention, which I see a lot in organizations, but I've also seen a lot in sports clubs, specifically mine. So I'm going to mention it. People solve a problem and they get given more work or more volunteering responsibilities because they've managed to solve a problem that was taking ages. So for example, there was a guy at my tennis club who built an online membership system that saved shed loads of time, right? And made his life so much easier. But because he was good at it, they asked him to build a court booking system. Now, he did it, but then he turned around and said, I don't want to do any more volunteering ever again. Because actually he hadn't got any benefit from the program. I mean, they didn't do anything for him at all. They didn't even really thank him. And therefore it really, really bugged him, and they lost that problem solving skill. Super common. Leaders are very forward focused. A lot of you, if you're on this program and if you're in leadership positions, will be very forward focused and solution focused. And you won't necessarily be bothered about getting credit yourself, but you might forget that the people who've been involved should benefit as well. And so we tend to, as leaders, move on straight away to the next problem. What's the next problem? How can we fix it? How can we get forwards? You need to always look backwards and think about who helped you to solve the problem and how they are benefiting. And I don't mean money. It's very rarely about money, even in paid jobs. Quite often it's about respect, recognition, and maybe getting some free time. So if someone's come up with a brilliant way of making their job less admin heavy, why not give them some of the time back to work on things they like working on? Because we know that works from motivation. So that's a little bit about problem solving in a bit more detail in terms of structures. I just briefly want to talk about ideation processes or ideation games, and then we're going to go through one in detail for the last 25 minutes or so. So ideation games, really dark in here. I look like I'm in a brothel or something. So ideation games, hello, it's all gone wrong. Sorry about that. Ideation games are effectively a process, but very specifically, they are a process designed to create as many ideas as possible and refine them. So rather than problem solving, it's more like you've got a brief to come up with solutions and to think about how you might implement them. You can use ideation games, which are effectively processes, to solve problems as well. I don't want to suggest you can't. And ideation games are used mostly in innovation and innovative thinking, right? And I'm going to show you an example of one. I'm going to briefly talk about two different types, and then we're going to do one. So this is how Disney ideate, or it was about 6 years ago. I don't know if they still do it this way. Disney have rooms, right? And they nixed the idea from Pixar, but they made it fancier as far as I understand it. And physically in their offices, back in the days when we weren't remote, they had these beautiful rooms that you could book out. And they had dream rooms, realism rooms, and critic rooms, right? And you could book them out, and they had literally, because Disney have got money, right? So they made them beautiful. The dreamers room was really inspirational. It had loads of inspirational pictures around it. But fundamentally, the idea was to create a physical journey on creating ideas and prioritizing them, right? And they used to do this with making animation and films and all sorts. And so they had the dreamers, the realists, and the critics. And the idea was everyone gets in a room together and does something that gets referred to later on as parallel thinking. So we've talked about convergent and divergent. Group thinking can be done in a parallel way, or it can be done in a conflicting way. In short, what does that mean? Conflicting, think about what happens in Parliament. People argue with each other the idea to produce the best solution. Parallel, everyone thinks in a structured way in the same way at the same time, and then moves on to the next stage and different structured thinking at the same time. And that's what Disney did. So they would put you in the dreamers room, or you would go in the dreamers room, and you would all dream up and be as many creative ideas as you could, right? And they had loads of inspiring materials in there, and they had old fable books, and they had all sorts of stuff to help people think about what might be different ways and ideas. And then they would physically get up and then come back to the process at a different stage, because time helps all things. And they would move into the stage of realism in a different room, right? And so they had all these like really rough ideas. And only then were they allowed to critique? So no, the idea of the phrase "no idea is a bad idea" was literally how it worked. And then finally, at Realist, it was like, okay, well, let's work out what that would look like. How much would it cost? How would we do that? Let's think about how we implement and make it practical. So then they would have proposals. And at that point, they would have what's called the spoiler room, which I think was a pun on boiler room, but I'm not sure. And the idea of spoiler was that you were meant to find as many problems as you could, right? And by parallel thinking, what you find is that people are much more able to come up with more ideas than if they would have done it separately or if they would have done it through conflict. It's been drawn from, those of you who remember doing the personal values and the self-awareness and the balanced processing, we talked about Japanese approaches to management. It's very similar in its idea to that, getting everyone thinking about things in the same way. So that's at its simplest. What we're going to do now is I'm going to show you a different version of it, and we're going to do it. So when I mentioned parallel thinking, what you can see is another way of describing thinking. You've got people who are singular and in terms of perspectives and focus. So what you've got there is a grid where you've got multiple people focusing on different things and multiple perspectives. You get very disparate thinking, right? So that's really powerful when you're trying to come up with as many ideas as possible. But when you have a single focus with multiple perspectives, you can get parallel thinking. And that allows you to create lots and lots more ideas, lots more ways of thinking, or lots more resources for one way of thinking. And then if you've got single perspectives, fundamentally, you'll only ever get groupthink. So if everyone thinks in the same way, which we all now know from the problems of culture fit in organizations, if an organization recruits all the same kind of people, they will get groupthink because everyone thinks in the same way. And if you only focus on one thing, you end up with very adversarial, which is like you would see in Parliament, for example, where you get one issue and they rip each other to shreds and actually no one's got anywhere on it. So one of the original guys who talked about parallel thinking was a guy called Edgar de Bono. And Edgar de Bono had 6 hats, and he has a book called 6 Thinking Hats. And they were actual hats, right? That's Edgar de Bono. He's written a book. It's like 20, 30 pages long. It's not long. It's great. It's really practical. And it's really great if you're a leader trying to come up with ways to facilitate people. So his 6 hats are coloured. And lovely. So de Bono has 6 hats, right? Now, the thing I love about 6 hats is it's physical. I'm trying to see if I've got my hats here. So when I do this with teams, I bring in hats, right? Sometimes I make people make hats out of paper. And sometimes I bring in beanie hats that I've got in different colours. I've also got a top hat somewhere that's red, which I quite like. But the idea is to create a physical nudge to the way that you're thinking, because we're really bad at thinking a certain way. And there are 6 hats. Intuitive, that means your gut or your emotions. It's like when someone says something, what's the first thought that comes into your head? Informative, constructive, reflective, creative, and cautious. And to give you a bit more detail, what does that mean? Okay, so the red hat is your feeling. The blue hat manages the process, right? Someone in the room should always at the beginning set, why are we doing this? What part of the process are we? How are we going to do it? Red hat is feelings, hunches, intuitions, and emotions. You want to use that hat. You know, I mentioned earlier about cognitive biases and people have to own them and honestly appraise them. That's the red hat. Get it out on the table and admit that those are your feelings. It will help the whole group to move past them. The white hat is purely about gathering information and stating facts. And if people are stating opinions, they should be challenged on that. The yellow hat is about seeing the silver lining. So looking only for the positives. The black hat is looking for the risks. So it's not about being critical. It's about cautious and critical thinking. So that is not about ripping people's ideas to shreds, but it's about understanding and looking at what might the problems be. And green hat is about ideation. So coming up with as many hats and ideas as possible. So hopefully I think you're now all on the right slide, which should have all of the facts on it. The information about the hats. So de Bono uses these hats, and the idea is that you all wear the hats in your team at the same time, right? So you're all wearing red hat. You don't all have to have red hats. It could be quite fun. Normally the leader puts the hat on and then everyone, because the leader then looks silly. But the idea is to signal to the room and give permission to challenge when people aren't thinking in the structured way that you want them to. And the idea with these hats is that depending on what your problem or innovation is, you use them in different orders. And in his books, he gives a full list. But so, for example, you might be trying to improve a process. And to do that, you always start and end with the blue hat, because that's like the summary hat in the beginning and the kickoff hat. But in between that, you might use the white hat to gather information about what the process is and how it works at the moment. Use the white hat to gather other people's views. Then you might use the yellow hat to think about what all the positives are about the way the process works at the moment, so that you want the things you want to keep. You then might look at the black hat and say, okay, well, what's not working? What could go wrong if we do change it? So that idea of like, is it going to cost us money? Then, and only then, might you start creating ideas. And then you might use the red to say, okay, this is what I feel could be the best. And then you might park it there and come back to it, for example. So the idea is that you use different orders and create structure. So we talked about the process at the very beginning of today. And this is a way of creating a code to allow you to order them in different, to create different achievements. And we're going to have a go at it. So what I'm going to ask you to do for the rest of the session, firstly, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, right? I might give you 3. I'm feeling generous, right? And in a moment, I'm going to start the clock. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, at the end of this session, it's not going to happen, by the way, so don't get too excited. But at the end of this session, you unexpectedly get given £500 individually. And you can only spend it on your personal professional development. So stuff that will help you develop as a person and or professionally. And you've got to spend it in the next 12 months. You have 3 minutes to come up with your best ideas for what you could spend that money on. Go. Stop. Okay, now I would like you to put your favorite single idea. I know the slide says 3 and you should have 3 written down, but just your favorite single idea in the chat of what you'd like to spend the money on. Got a couple coming in, new courses, economist subscription. I think you could get more than an economist subscription. I think if you're a student, you can get really good value on, you might not be a student anymore, an economist subscription these days. Presenting in the digital age. Oh, that's, okay. Lots of ideas coming through, brilliant. Now what I'd like to do is we are gonna have a go at coming up with some alternatives to your first individual ideas, right? Volunteer when people are experiencing hardship, put things in perspective. I want to apply to grad med, so course to improve my pre-exam scores. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into rooms quickly. What we're going to do is I've designed a process to help us get better. So you've got lots of good ideas in there, but we're going to see if we can improve on any of them. And the process I've chosen is blue, white, red, yellow, black, blue. That's the process we're going to use. And we're going to use like a minute or 2 on each to the end. Right? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break you into groups, and you've got 2 minutes, right, to come up with as many, 2 minutes to come up with as many questions for me as possible about the scenario, right? So you haven't got any other information at the moment other than there's 500 quid, but you may well have other questions, right? So what I want you to do is I'm going to put you in groups, and I want you to think about all the questions you want to ask me and anything that you don't know that you think would have helped you come up with better answers. So it might be information I have, or it might be information someone else has, but what are the things you'd want to know to be able to come up with more ideas? So I'm going to open the rooms now. when you're going to come back, you're all going to get to put into chat as many questions or requests for information as you would want to be able to better your original idea. Let's have a look. Is there a time limit? So you've got to spend the money within the next 12 months. But it doesn't have to start any particular time. Is it ring fenced? No ring fencing. Is it within your city, region, UK? Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to say it's within the UK. But that's a great question. Does it have tangible? Does it have to be tangible? No, it doesn't have to be tangible. If you want to spend 500 quid paying someone to sit in your front room while you talk at them, that's absolutely groovy. Do we have to spend it all at once? No. Can it go on one thing? No. Can you invest it? Ooh, interesting. Yes, but you still need to decide what to do with it at the end of 12 months. I'm not sure how much 500 quid will get you in a month, in 12 months. Although Dan wanted to put it on the horses. So there you go. Is there anything that you need, not necessarily want? Can it only go on one thing? Ooh, Dan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I want to know if we can pull the money. You
can pull the money. So yes, if you wanted to, any number of you could choose to pull the money. 1, 2, 3, or many. Any other questions that you've thought about? Do you have to spend it all at once? No. Has anyone else got any other questions that they would like to know? So the questions I would expect to see alongside these is, do you have any recommendations for where we might find good pricing? How much would I, like, you might want to know how much different courses are or different things you're thinking about if you don't know already. You might I'll tell you the question that I would ask. I'd turn around to Dan, who knows a bit about this, and Andy, who knows a bit about this, and I'd say, what would you do with the money? So facts and info doesn't have to be just facts. You can just be getting other people's opinions, for example. Okay, so it's a really important part of the stage because asking questions in itself, even without the answers, helps you broaden your thinking. So I hadn't even thought about going abroad. I'm going to change it. You can go abroad if you want. So I hadn't even thought about going abroad, but now that opens up a whole new world. Okay, next we're going to do the red stage. I want you to pick 1 or 2 words to describe instinctively how you feel about the chance of getting your hands on £500 to help your personal and professional development. Can I have £500 now, please? That is an excellent question, Greg, and no, not right now. So 1 or 2 words that describe how you feel about getting the money for something that you've thought of or that you'd like the idea of. How do you feel? Pressured. Yeah. Suddenly feels very real, doesn't it? What else? Dan, Andy, how do you feel?
I'm excited about it. I definitely feel pressure as well, actually, about the fact we've got to make a decision quite quickly.
Yeah, but the worry of the perception of how you spent it, I think. That's why it makes the decision a little bit more difficult.
Okay, excited, intrigued, not massively fast, pressured. We just got 2 more minutes and then we'll be finishing up, guys. I hope that's okay. Okay, so lots of not massively fussed, right? Because for some people, it's very difficult or it's not interesting to them to think about things in the hypothetical, or money might not be a solution for them. And money is not always the solution. So the next stage is to think about all the ideas. So go back to your list of 3, and as quickly as you can, in shorthand, if you could type in, and each one be a separate answer, the other 2 ideas you had, and any other ideas you're now having, and pop them into chat, and let's see all of those ideas come through. LinkedIn Premium, go on holiday, post-lockdown bar crawl. Oh, Jake, speaking my language. I think it would be good for my mental health and resilience. Although probably not, because I'm old and I get hangovers. Any other ideas that you had? Job experiences. Okay, I like that. Any others? So we had coaching and mentoring, someone mentioned earlier. Help or products for learning a language. Experiences abroad, applying something like the chance of working abroad for 3 months and getting set up. Books, so an Amazon wish list for my learning and book membership. Audible, What other ideas have we got? Mentoring, coaching, going on a training course, anything else? Okay, so at this stage, already, you may still be attached to your first idea because we know that's happening, but we've got loads more different ideas. Self-management mentoring. Yeah, I could do some of that too. And you've got loads of other ideas already. So now it's about thinking, just take a moment to reflect on what some of the challenges or risks might be of spending £500 on personal professional development. And have a think about them and jot them in the chat. And then Dan, I'll come to you. What do you think the risks or the challenges are in spending £500?
So you're asking me now?
Yes, while they're jotting their stuff in. Yes, please.
The risks and challenges in spending £500?
Yeah, on this and being forced to do so, and getting you to decide now.
I don't see it.
What might go wrong?
I don't see it as being massively risky. I don't think anything terrible can happen.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is to get it right in the short space of time. So the challenge that I feel with this is that personal development is something that needs a bit of thought, and you're putting pressure on us to make a decision quite quickly. So for me, it's all about how can we do something good and purposeful that's going to benefit in the short time scale that you've given us. So it's like you're asking us to make a decision that's going to last 12 months, but you've only given us 3 minutes to make the decision. So that's the challenge that my head is sort of spinning with a little bit.
Yeah. Don't want to waste it on something gimmicky. Don't know what the options are. So I would assume for a lot of you don't know what 500 would buy you in learning and development and stuff that you're not familiar with, particularly if it was like coaching or training or subscriptions, and you'd want more time to research that. You'd want more time to think about people. So flushing out the risks is much easier when you've been through the process of generating ideas, because it starts to feel real. And then you start to be, okay, well, actually, I want to, technically there's no risk. There's no risk to you except through trust. So if you waste it and I'm annoyed because it's my money, then you break trust, but that's about it. You're right. So technically there's limited risk to you. But you will feel sad if you waste it and it's not helpful. And Hannah makes a really good point, which is money might not be the solution. So actually, you're not sad at all, but that's okay. So actually, the point of the risk stage is to get out and challenge back. So at this stage, you might say, hang on, I don't want 500 quid, but I do want some help finding a mentor in the sector that I want to work in. Or you might say, hang on, can I have another 3 weeks to research this, because I'm not going to spend the money well. So the point of doing the risks at that stage is that you've already started to feel like you've got rational and real examples of ideas, and you can start to challenge them. And then finally, you would move to review, and you would say, okay, we've got some great ideas. You would go back and look at all the ideas that everyone else generated as well as your own. You would say, which one do I prefer the most, or which 2 or 3 do I prefer? And now I'm going to go and explore the extra information I need and the risks. And by creating a process, you allow yourself to be guided through the thinking and the deciding. And where do you get to? Well, you get to, I don't want to make a decision right now, knee jerk. So I'm going to see and I'm going to push back. And often by going through this process, you'll get better at pushing back with senior staff as well. Because you'll be like, look, I've been through it. I've done a load of research, and actually we need to make this decision over more time. And that can be a really, really powerful thing. So that's De Bono. I'm going to send you a link to have a go at it, so you can have a play if you want. It's really good. I've used it for sports team selection in individual sports, deciding who plays where. I find it really useful to get the team involved and decide who plays what on tennis orders. And we just use a really simple process. But that is the end of today's session. I'm sorry, I'm 3 minutes over. And as always, I hang around for questions afterwards. I'll send out the slides and the recording. If you've got any questions,